Hello, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm so delighted to be joined here today with members of our CHS and Hour 25 communities, and also with our special guest, John C. Franklin. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
John, I'm so excited that you're joining us today. I want to let everyone know that you are here to talk about a topic that's very near and dear to you. You'll be talking about Kinyras, the divine lyre. And this is a fascinating topic for many of us because it is referenced in Homer, a text that we've read. This figure is referenced in Homer, a text that we're all very familiar with, but we probably don't realize that there's a whole expansive system of mythology around this figure, right? And cult.
That's right. That's right. There's the reference in the Iliad in Book 11 to the breastplate of Agamemnon that was made by Kinyras with all the decorative work, figurative work of animals and so on. And so people will have heard of him because of that passage. And the other famous passage is in the Metamorphoses of Ovid, where there's a fairly long episode that Orpheus sings about his daughter Mira, who seduces him, falls in love with him, and with the help of a helpful nurse, goes to his room by night and seduces him. And from this union comes Adonis, and she's, of course, transformed into the myrrh bush. And the sap drops from that bush are her tears. That's what the Metamorphosis is based upon. And then the sap is used to anoint the baby Adonis. So those are two passages that most classicists are familiar with. But as you say, there's much, much more.
Right. Well, before we get into the real deep part of this discussion, I just want to tell people a little bit about you and your background, okay? I want to let everyone know that you're the Associate Professor and Chair of Classics at the University of Vermont. You actually began your professional career in music composition at the New England Conservatory of Music and at the MIT Media Lab. Then you switched to classes, earning a PhD at the University of College at London. Your research deals with cultural and especially the musical interface between Greece and the Near East. So you really cover a large area. You've recently completed a book, as we mentioned, on the divine instruments called Kinyras, the Divine Lyre, which is available through Harvard University Press and Print. Or if people want to read that online, they can read the entire book at chs.harvard.edu. If you click on publications, you can browse and find the entire text, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. We also want to let people know that you're a composer and that you are incorporating aspects of ancient musical practice into your compositions. For instance, you have worked on recomposed scores for productions of ancient dramas, and you also have an electronically realized impression of ancient music. It's called the Cyprus-Syrian Girl, Hits of the Ancient Hellenes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did I get that right? Yeah. Great. So I mean, I could go on. You've been a fellow at the Center for Hellenic Studies at the American Academy in Rome and several other places, but I want to get right into the heart of our topic now, and hopefully we can touch upon all these aspects of your career. But first, introduce us to this culture hero and this divine instrument, right? Because there are, when you look at the literature and at the evidence from the ancient world, we kind of have two figures, right? A thing, a numinous thing, and a person. So can you help us understand what these two aspects of what you're studying are and how they relate to one another?
Right. This was the central problem I set out to investigate, because these two things that you just mentioned seem to be so different. So Kinyras was known from those two passages that we mentioned earlier, and many other sources. Other scholars had collected these. Claude Beaurain did a quite thorough collection in the 1980s. So Kinyras as a figure of Cypriot mythology, because he's always connected with Cyprus, or in most of the sources. There's others that place him in Syria or Cilicia or the Levant, but the dominant association is with Cyprus. So that it was fairly well known that he was established as a culture hero for that island. He's always connected with the period of what we would call the late Bronze Age, prior to the Aegean immigrations to the island. And he's connected with typical industries of the island, especially the discovery of copper, the working of copper and other metals, seafaring, perfumed oils, temple building. So in a way, he seems to be a magnet for some of the most important Cypriot cultural possessions, I guess you could say, in the pre-Greek period. But then in the 1950s, 50s, published in the 60s, several tablets were found from the Syrian coastal city of Ugarit, which is just opposite Cyprus on the Syrian coast, Ras Shamra, modern Ras Shamra, which was an important city for other reasons, for shining light on the back history of the biblical texts. It's somewhat removed from the Phoenician cities, so it's not an exact ancestor culturally to what you find in the biblical world, but a very close cousin or uncle, let's say, or aunt. So we knew this city has provided a lot of information about cults, political arrangements, sociology, and so on of the Levant in the Bronze Age. But in the 50s and 60s, several texts were published, discovered and published, that gave lists of different divinities. They appear to be texts that record lists of gods that need to be sacrificed to or worshipped on certain occasions. So it's not a sort of master, it's not, here's all our gods in Ugarit. It's just, here's a list of gods. Some of them have check marks, and it looks as though they were used in rituals to say, okay, we gave the oil to that god, and we gave the we gave the bowl to that god, and so on. And in several of these lists, we find two objects that are divinized. One is a perfume burner or incense burner, and the other is the kinaru, which is a word spread throughout the western part of the Near East, Syria, the Levant, spilling into Egypt, Armenia, eventually you find it in Armenian, and a number of other languages later. But in the Bronze Age, there's a Levant and northern Syria as the home area. For lyre, this is the same word that we find in Hebrew as the kinor of King David. So now we know that it's divinized because in these lists, several of them have Akkadian versions. Now Akkadian, there's also Ugaritic versions, but Ugaritic is just a cuneiform alphabet. Gives no vowels, just gives consonants and no other information. But in the texts that have columns with Akkadian equivalents, you'll see KNR, Kinaru, Ugaritic, and then in Akkadian, it'll spell it out syllabically, so we know exactly the phonology of it, so we know what dialect group it comes from and so on. And they use something called determinatives, which are separate cuneiform signs that tell you what category something belongs in. So it has the Kinaru here has two determinatives. One is gish, which is Sumerian for wood. So that tells us that this is not a person called Kinaru, but a wooden object. Must be the lyre. And then it has the second determinative, which is dinger, the Sumerian word for divine, and is very commonly used in scribal practice to designate gods, of all kinds of gods. So it's absolutely clear that we're dealing with a divinized instrument. Now, as soon as this was discovered, all the leading Semiticists said, Ugarit, Cyprus, they're right across the strait from each other. Phonetically, we know that these two words can be related. Kinyras from a Canaanite or Phoenician cognate to Kinaru, so from a little farther south in the dialect zone. Linguistically, there's no problem. The problem is conceptually. How can you connect a divinized object to what appears to be a mythological figure with all these stories? So yeah, this was the central problem that I set about to investigate. So the question is, I guess, how can we connect them? That
exactly.
Read the book.
Yes. No, that's good. That's good. Yes.
Well, so it was pointed out fairly soon, and this was one of the trails I followed, that divinized objects are a very well attested phenomenon in Mesopotamia, going back to the 3rd millennium BC.
Now, how do we know that?
Again, from various texts, but god lists are another category that are abundantly attested. There's also, I guess you'd say, more literary texts. One of the prize specimens is 2 cylinders about so tall. They're in the Louvre. Let's see if I can get my, they're about a foot and a half tall. They're clay cylinders, and they're inscribed all around with a text that relates to the building and dedication of a temple to a god called Ningirsu, who is the patron deity of a city called Lagash. And in this text, it describes the building and all the processes around the building, including invoking the gods and so on. And in there, we find the building and dedication of a number of cult objects, including architectural features like doorways, or the table for the god, or the scepter that the god, presumably the statue, holds, and these instruments called balang, which we know from lexical text in the Syrian side of Ebla are equated with kinaru. So there's some similarity between those two words. And these balangs are, the building of them is described in the first cylinder. So they used the cedar wood, and they used various adornments, and the construction is detailed in them. And we even know from other external texts that a whole year for the city of Lagash was named after the year in which this balang was constructed. So it was a very momentous event. And then in the second cylinder, it flips from talking about the building of the temple to imagining the god moving into his temple, and all the lesser gods that are in his in his entourage moving into the temple. And those lesser gods include all of these objects, and they're personified and often given family relationships. So his oldest son is the cupbearer to his table, and his mace is his his military leader, and his divine balang, one of them, is his minstrel, and the other balang is his lamentation priest. So two different musical functions associated with the same instrument. And so it describes them, in this long procession moving into the temple and taking up residence as though they were mythological figures, which they are, but they're also objects. So this is the essential point that lets you move from the divine Kinaru at Ugarit to a figure in Greco-Cypriot mythology that has all these personified characteristics.
Wow. Okay, so I think we're trying to get a sense now of sort of the mindset in the ancient Mediterranean, that this is actually something that makes a lot of sense, right, within this context, that you would have divine objects that are associated with mythologies, with personalities and mythologies. I'd like to turn it over to our community members at this point to see if they have any comments or questions, reactions to what they've heard so far. Does anyone have something? I see Bill has a hand up. Bill, please.
Good morning from where I am. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, I'm interested in hearing about the conflict between the Cypriot form of music and the form of music represented by Apollo.
Okay.
So whenever that comes up in the conversation, that's what I'm looking forward to.
Okay.
Thanks.
Talk about that now, I guess?
That's fine. Can you orient us a little bit with that question? I mean, what is the relationship between, because there are some connections between this figure and Apollo, right?
That's correct. There's quite a few. So, well, there was one of the problems in connecting Kinaru, the lyre, with Kinyras is that there's only a few, or formerly were believed to be only a few, passages that connected Kinyras himself with music. I collected more and made sort of arguments to expand the case for that. But the one that Bill is referring to comes from Eustathius, the Homeric commentator from the Byzantine period. And he preserves for us a myth from some older source that is a musical contest between Kinyras and Apollo. And it takes the typical form of an Apollo-like figure, either a prophet or an archer or a musician, that challenges Apollo and then is defeated by Apollo and typically killed. There's other examples of this, and it's usually interpreted in historical terms as the encounter between historically distinct figures through cultural contact. So as the cult of Apollo became pan-Hellenized and it sort of spread in this guise throughout the Greek world, he would come up against local figures that had similar powers in their domain. And there were different ways to express this encounter. So one of the key musical passages, I think, is Pindar. So this is in the 5th century. And he, it's a much more complex ode, but within this passage in question, he describes Pindar as the beloved priest of Aphrodite and beloved of Apollo. So this is one way of expressing the relationship between the two, is you can make the sort of the marginal figure or the epicoric figure, the local figure, a son or a daughter of the Pan-Hellenic figure, a lover, or a rival in other cases. So in the myth of the contest of lyres, it's expressed rather as a as a hostile encounter. So I suppose there's various ways to interpret it. In the book, I referred to a sort of juxtaposition between two musical traditions, one native to Cyprus, and always bearing in mind that Kinyras' dominant associations are with the pre-Greek period. And that was a big time in Cypriot history. They were a great kingdom, according to the peer assessment of the Hittite emperor and the pharaoh of New Kingdom Egypt, and the Babylonian king, the Mitannian king. They wrote to each other, and they had a very definite way of talking and addressing each other. And the king of late Bronze Age Cyprus was called my brother. That means he was an equal status, which means he was a great king. So he had more than, it meant that he was a king of other lesser kings or rulers, presumably on most or all of Cyprus. That's the scholarly consensus, although that's a controversy. But so we have a very sort of well-defined and prominent Cypriot culture in the pre-Greek period. Then you have a period of Aegean immigration in the 12th century and the 11th century. Again, this is a very big question with a lot of controversies attached to it. But one way or another, by the time you get down to the inscriptions of the historical period and to the texts, you have Greek as the majority language on the island. So you therefore have some major infusion of Greek culture. It's now thought that it syncretized in various ways with the pre-Greek culture to create a uniquely Cypriot culture. But nevertheless, you definitely had a strong Aegean input culturally, and therefore you must assume also a musical tradition or several musical traditions. So I see this conflict between Kinyras and Apollo as one way of expressing these two traditions of music coming together and interacting, and a sort of competition between the two. Not necessarily hostile as the myth would suggest, but perhaps in some cases, the Cypriot singers wishing to maintain, stake their claim on the island for their tradition. And conversely, the Aegean tradition sort of eventually subsuming or dominating in some sense over the local tradition. Another phenomenon that is worth noting looks more at a syncretism of the two traditions. And this is a recently discovered inscription from Paphos, in which Apollo is invoked alongside other deities. It's a loyalty oath to Tiberius, so it's early 1st century CE. But Apollo is invoked under the epithet Kenurestes, the Kenira player. This was demonstrated recently by J.B. Kayla. The inscription was known for a while, but that epithet was misread when first published. So this was a fantastic discovery, and it's another common phenomenon that an Olympian god will take an epithet that expresses its former relationship with one of these local figures. So it's in a way subsuming, but still honoring and acknowledging the memory of that local figure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned in your book is that it's so unusual to be able to track the entire life cycle, I think, of a mythical figure, right? And that's something that you have been able to do. Can you talk a little bit about, can you outline us for us, then the rest of the whole cycle, and then explain to us why that's so unusual, do you think?
Okay, let me do it the other way around. So it's unusual because so many Greek mythological figures are rooted in the Bronze Age, for which we have relatively few sources. We do have the linear beat tablets that tell us some of the cults that were known. So we can trace the cult of Zeus and Poseidon. And of course, on comparative Indo-European studies, you can demonstrate that the Dioscuri or Zeus are Indo-European figures. So there too, you can trace a long life cycle. But for many of the lesser figures, they sort of appear in the first millennium and you're not really sure where they came from. Or Mycenaean deities die out and become heroes, whereas they had been gods previously. So, but in the Near East, of course, you have written records going much farther back. So in the case of Mesopotamia, you're going all the way back to the early the third millennium, so the early part of that millennium in some cases. So with Kinyras, because he's connected with Cyprus, he comes into the Greek scope eventually by the 12th and 11th century and sort of passes into the classical tradition, the Greco-Roman literary sources, But he has this back history for another 1,500 or even 2,000 years in the Near East, if you allow that divinized objects are relevant to his formation. So if you accept that premise, the life cycle of Kinyras would be as follows. So the Kinaru lyre, we can trace it back linguistically probably to the 4th millennium, 3rd millennium on texts, but on comparative linguistic grounds and iconography, we assume that this instrument and name goes back to the 4th millennium. That's very, very early. And it also gives you a sense of why these instruments were treated with such reverence, because they were one of the most complicated physical objects that were made at that time. So technologically very advanced. They allowed a kind of communication with the gods. They were used in rituals. They're used for prophesying. They allowed the singer to give voice to divinities and communicate to the divine. So this explains the treatment of them as divinities. So this ancient form of lyre, coming up into the 3rd millennium, say at the city of Ebla, where it's first attested around 2400 BC, and we find it used in the divine ancestor cult of the kings there, used for lamenting fallen kings. This important sociological function is reflected in the divinization of the instrument, which is first attested at Ugarit 1,000 years after the Ebla evidence, but you assume that there's some important back history to allow it to be divinized by, let's say, 1300. And then somehow or other, this is still a bit mysterious, quite the historical link, because we're coming on to the, the break between the end of the Bronze Age, when you have this system-wide collapse and you lose records even at a number of Near Eastern centers like Ugarit, which is destroyed. And then you're picking up the thread in the Greco-Roman sources 400 or 500 years later. But somehow there was a transmission of this, divine lyre and its use in cult to the pre-Greek period of Cyprus, and some elaboration of its mythology in the way that we see in the Sumerian sources. My view is that the conclusion I came to after doing all this sort of, indirect evidence and trying to make it all fit into one picture was that Kinyras must have been cultivated officially by the kings of pre-Greek Cyprus, and even as a form of like a performance role in royal cult, which sounds far out, but the best analogy for it is King David in the Bible. So this is a figure that historically, one would place around 1,000 if one believes in him, which I think there's really no good reason not to. And he is a king who is preeminently a lyre player. He comes to the throne because he's a lyre player, because Saul is suffering from the evil spirit, and he sends for a lyre player. He doesn't want David specifically. He wants someone who can play the lyre in a magical way to drive away the evil spirits. And David is so qualified, and he comes on the scene, and he ends up, of course, coming to the throne. But his big famous scene with the lyre is when he transfers the ark to Jerusalem. So I think here we have the best analogy for understanding what happened on Cyprus. We have a king who's carrying out a key function of the royal cult, that is the head of the pantheon. Yahweh is the one God, but in earlier times we know that there was a more polytheistic background in that part of the world. So he's conducting this very important state ritual. He's doing it as the lyre player. He leads all his guilds of musicians. He leads even his chief singer. He leads all his own lyre players at the head of the procession, playing the lyre, as though this were necessary somehow to make this transfer of the ark succeed. So this is, so did David really do that? Maybe not. Maybe this is one of the cases in which he's been mythologized. But the story pattern there is a real pattern. And it's essentially what we find for Kinyras, I think. And it's again, just across the water. Kinyras, the phonology of it takes us not to Ugarit, but down to the Canaanite cities, which gets you very close to Israel and Judah. So I think this is the way you explain getting from the physical object and the kind of myths you imagine around it to the specific political historical conjunction on pre-Greek Cyprus, where he was so importantly or so prominently promoted in this guise that he lingered on in popular mythology after the fall of the Bronze Age kingdom, and therefore passed into Greco-Cypriot lore and thence into all of the normal Greco-Roman sources. And so once then he's sort of not quite dead, but he's going into his afterlife, and he comes down more as a figure of legend. Mira becomes the sort of paragon of womanly lack of virtue, lack of control. Then there's the whole question of sacred prostitution at Paphos, and Kinyras causing a favorite prostitute to be divinized. That's the sort of Christian polemic against the pagan gods. And some of those themes go all the way down into to the end of antiquity and into the Byzantine period. So that's the whole life cycle, I think.
John, that is such a beautiful description. And I think you made very helpful connections for us. We really have a sense of how that happened and about the time period. So I'd like to open it up again to our community members here if they have questions or comments or reactions to what you've shared so far. I also encourage them to introduce themselves and where they're from if they
that'd be nice
do
to
have
know.
a comment or question, because we have people joining from all over. Anyone have anything just yet? Oh, Maria, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Are you
Okay,
Maria
great.
Xanthu?
Yes.
Okay.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Very nice. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Well, it's a very plain, very straightforward question. I'm just wondering, for all the with all this wonderful description you just made, could we consider, in a sense, Cyprus as the geographical, in a way, entrance point of the lyre into the Mediterranean world, and then into the Cyclades, and then into Greece mainland, and then its transmission all over the Mediterranean world? I mean, would you identify this as a possible itinerary, or can you point us to some other geographical points?
Okay, that's a great question. It's still a question that has not been satisfactorily answered, so there's a lot of nice work to do here, hopefully. The usual view, for instance, in Martin West's Ancient Greek Music, which I mentioned because it's so influential, therefore
Absolutely.
It has created the usual view. But it's not original to him, but he's strongly reinforced it by supporting it, is that stringed instruments as a whole originated in the Near East. And he says specifically Mesopotamia. This is the easiest solution because we have such old evidence there. However, I don't think it's conclusively proven. So one point, Dominique Collon has in several studies, I can send you them if you're interested, as PDFs or the references, has looked at all the iconographical representations of stringed instruments. And they go back, as I said, to the 4th millennium. And there's no particular reason from this evidence to privilege Mesopotamia over North Syria. The oldest evidence is, in fact, North Syria. It still doesn't mean that North Syria is the origin. It's simply where we have the earliest images. So, so the question of where they originated is not satisfied there, even though the Near East between Syria and Mesopotamia does give us the oldest set of iconography. So now a related thing. You already have, as you know, in the Cycladic figurines, you have the famous harp players. And these shapes are distinct from the later lyres. Musicologists classify them as harps versus lyres, but this distinction may not be relevant at such an early date. But it's been pointed out for some time that seemingly the closest shaped instruments to the Cycladic harps come from the early etchings in the 4th millennium BC at Megiddo in the Levant. Now, are these two related or not? It's hard to say because the Megiddo etching seems to be very roughly done. So how accurate it is, we're not sure. Some people say it's intended to be more of a usual lyre shape, kinaru shape, but it's just not been done competently. Others say, no, we're looking at a transitional form before harps and lyres were really distinguished. So, so now moving on to the sort of third topic, you've got the Cycladic figurines are very early. They're much earlier than any Cypriot representations we have. And they're earlier than any other Aegean ones, earlier than any Minoan ones or mainland ones. So what's the chain of transmission? We don't have the evidence to say that Cyprus played a special role as opposed to maybe a common diffusion out of Anatolia. So it's just that we just don't have the pieces. But I would say that as a general principle, when trying to connect phenomena from the Aegean with phenomena from the Near East, one must always consider the important function of Cyprus. If not an exclusive intermediary, definitely an important one. So that's my take. And in my book, and other scholars are now taking this stance. Cyprus, it's been accepted for a while that Cyprus is key for examining transmission of phenomena, but it's also very interesting to study as a self-contained insular culture in its own right. People have often raided Cypriot evidence to explain Greek or Aegean evidence, or to explain Near Eastern evidence. And so Cypriot art, for instance, is often characterized as a melange of Aegean and Near Eastern elements. But it's also quite interesting to look at Cypriot art as, this is Cypriot art. Maybe it has some sympathies with these two other areas. Maybe it was the sort of intermediate point for those, but it's very much its own thing as well. That's not the question you're asking, but it's sort of a promotion for Cyprus as a Cyprocentric view.
Yes, no, I think what you just said is really very insightful, and it really gives us a perspective about geography and transmission. If Claudia allows me a second question, or may I keep that for...
No, please.
Okay, now, well, looking at your book, which is really very exciting, with a lot of bulk of information coming, I couldn't help thinking of a very old German book, which I know you know. It's Klein Gunther's Protos Heuretes. Mm-hmm. And again, I kept thinking of Martin West and Andrew Barker and all these people that did all this great research on ancient music. So I just wanted to ask how your book connects with, let's say, with scholarship at the end of 20th century, like Klein Gunther, which is a very general book, and then we move on to Martin West, and which direction, which innovative direction your book points towards to.
Are you interested in specifically music scholarship, or
yes,
scholarship
music, absolutely, yes, music.
I see. Okay. Well, so I started. When I started my doctoral research, I set out, I set out to compare Greek and Indic music vocabulary. And I had no experience with Sanskrit at that point. And so I was attempting to learn Sanskrit while starting my doctorate, which was a disaster. But fortunately, I very soon found reference to Mesopotamian musical texts. And these seemed to provide the link that I was looking for, specifically the way the names of the strings on the lyre were arranged, the musical function of a central string on the lyre. And we have analogies for these things in the Mesopotamian musical texts. So I compared these sets of evidence, and I concluded that the earliest recoverable evidence for the Greek lyric tradition, so archaic and earlier, this is evidence embedded in later musical sources and general sources, but you can reconstruct certain things. For instance, we know the names of the strings. We know from Aristotle and Plato and other non-specialist sources certain aspects of musical practice that must be older, i.e. archaic. So I concluded that the earliest recoverable lyric details about lyric practice and conceptions of lyre tuning and performance do indeed preserve vestiges of a Mesopotamian system. So that, and I think on the technical arguments, it's been fairly well accepted. Martin West was inclined to believe it. Stefan Hagel has accepted it in the general thrust. So when I finished my doctorate, I set about to revise this, and I wanted to provide a number of chapters that were case studies of the cultural and historical contexts that could explain this otherwise very surprising fact that you could draw a line from, say, 400 BC, Greek musical sources, back to 1800 BC, the Mesopotamian date of the Mesopotamian system, and earlier. across such a vast distance, where you have Syria intervening, Anatolia intervening, Cyprus intervening. And so one of the case studies was Cyprus and the figure of Kinyras. Martin West had mentioned him briefly in the East Face of Helicon as being the personification of the lyre. The name says as much, and Eustathius tells us explicitly that. And I began investigating Kinyras, and there ended up being so much information. I did this my year at the Center for Hellenic Studies. I just did a TLG search, and I searched in the Latin texts. There's so much information that it's taken me 10 years. Of course, I have other duties here at my job, but it's taken me a long time to sort it all out. So how does it connect? It didn't really give me a definitive answer for the transmission of this musical system. However, I do think it provides the most compelling available context. I don't think that any more compelling context can be reconstructed on the basis of our very limited evidence for the periods in question. So that context is specifically when you have the divinization of objects and musical instruments originating in Mesopotamia, there's certain specific things that are attached to those cults. There's certain proper ways to execute prayers and hymns and lamentations in order for the rituals to be effective. And I believe that the Mesopotamian musical system was one important aspect of this. Therefore, when these ideas were transmitted, and I believe in this case, Mesopotamia is the source for divinized instruments, to North Syria, to Ugarit, to Cyprus on my argument, that this musical system came along with it as part of those cults. They were imported in order to import what was at that time regarded as high technology, as effective religious technology. So knowledge of this system comes to Syria, to Cyprus, and therefore is within the Greek orbit. I believe that we can put the date of transmission for this musical system back to the Mycenaean period fairly confidently. First, on the evidence of the Greek string names, there's dialectal evidence which supports a Bronze Age originating date for the names. It's also the era in which you have palaces that are interconnected over very large distances with each other and sending specialists and trade missions and diplomatic missions across large distances. And we know that the Cretan palaces and the Achaean palaces were the western extent of this system. It's best documented in the Near Eastern sources, but those sources tell us that they were trading with the Aegean. So I think that this is really where the transmission of the lyric tradition, or the lyric technology, I'd like to say, because I don't see Greek lyric tradition as deriving from the Near East. It's its own tradition very much, but it's using a specific technology that does derive from the Near East. So it ties into the larger interest in the connections between the Aegean and the Near East, and in terms of contemporary musical scholarship, it provides an explanation for the backstory of the Greek technical material that's been receiving a lot of attention lately. Martin West's book, Stefan Hagel's breakthrough book a few years ago. So it fits into those two areas of contemporary scholarship.
John, in the course of your answers so far, you've brought up several really interesting points. You've mentioned that we know the names of the strings. You've mentioned that lyres are very advanced technologies for these cultures. Can you help us understand maybe a little bit more about the physicality of them? Okay, what exactly did they look like? What did they sound like, if we had a sense of that? And then maybe eventually we could talk a bit about, you've mentioned some things like lament and prayers and hymns. Help us understand what we would have heard, right? If we were listening. So let's get into the physicality. What is the lyre?
Okay, so by contemporary musicological definition, it's a convention. A lyre is an object with two arms. They can be straight, as in the Aegean typically. They can be diverging, as in the Near East often. And they have a crossbar that joins them. And the crossbar has holes in it that fit, typically, in the Greek kithara, for instance, fits over the arms. So you have a hole that goes over like this. So you have two holes on the crossbar sort of pulling together the arms and creating a tense frame. And then some sort of sounding body or resonators attached to it at the bottom. And the Aegean ones are in the Bronze Age are normally round-based. In the Near East, they're typically flat-based. This is one of the criteria that we have for distinguishing where lyres originate, because they can be shown on objects that travel to other places. And Cyprus, very interestingly, is a place where we find both types. And it's because of the different populations coming and going from the island. So that's the definition of the lyre. They're made of wood, but nice ones that would be used in royal cults would be adorned with gold, foil maybe, silver foil, precious stones, shell. You may be familiar with the famous big bull lyres from the royal graves of Ur in Mesopotamia. They have just really incredible lavish decoration, gold, bull's head, and so on. So one of the purposes for decorating them preciously like that was presumably, of course, it looked nice and you wanted to show your wealth off, but all of those substances that are decorated onto the bull lyres of Ur are also known from texts as ritual substances that help make rituals effective in various ways, purification rituals and so on. So presumably this made them more effective as ritual instruments. As far as the sound goes, I think you'd probably get a good sense just from a harp or a guitar. I mean, a plucked string is a plucked string. It'll have a slightly...
What were the strings made out of? Do we know?
Gut, typically gut. We have a certain amount of evidence in Greek sources for Greek instruments. The Homeric hymn to Hermes says that it uses female sheep gut. So I don't know why the female guts sound better. If there's some reason for that, maybe somebody knows. So sheep gut is one possibility. There's a thought that maybe linen strings were sometimes used, but that's a controversy. Now, there's a great guy named Andy Lowings who has a team in the UK that reconstructed the Sumerian bull lyre. If you Google that, you'll find some great videos and pictures. And his story of how he got this thing reconstructed is fantastic, with the cooperation of the Royal Air Force in Iraq, bringing up bitumen from Iraq up to the UK, and the gold donated by a company in South Africa and so on. A great story. But they had the idea, by looking at some of the lyre traditions that are still living in East Africa and coastal Saudi Arabia, that the bridge over which the strings passed on the Sumerian lyres may have been made not of metal or wood, which would give a sharp stop on the string and let it ring clearly, but of a roll of papyrus, which would be a little mushier, and so the ring would buzz against it like a sitar. Something like a sitar. Huh. And it sounds fantastic, and you think, why not? It sounds great. So I guess there are a few other possibilities for the timbre of the instrument.
Yeah.
As far as what they played on them, so the Mesopotamian musical texts that I mentioned earlier, the discovery there, and these two were discovered in the 60s and reconstructed in the 60s by Ann Kilmer at Berkeley and several others, was that a complete cycle of 7-note scales, just as we use in modern times, diatonic scales, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. 7 of them, as though you went from C to C for one, D to D for the second, E to E for the third, and so on. Just as, if you're a jazz musician or you know about the octave species, these were already known by 1800 BC in Mesopotamia. And prior to this discovery, the general view that was still accepted by West in ancient Greek music, and a lot of the standard music reference books that people are still relying on, at that point, it was thought that these kind of diatonic complete scales were sort of only realized by the Greeks in the 4th century. Wow. So this totally changed the backstory of ancient music. So we still don't know how they used these scales to make music, but we know that this was one set of tonal resources they had. Now, another piece of the picture is these famous hymns from Ugarit, where we have the divine Kinaru again. These are tablets that are hymns. There's various ones, but the intact famous one that you might hear on the radio or YouTube is a hymn to the moon goddess, Nikal. She's originally Sumerian moon goddess. The hymns themselves are written in the Hurrian language, which is not Semitic. It's a completely different language group. But they're found at Ugarit, which is a West Semitic language, and they're used in the cult there. And they use the Akkadian interval names that we know from the Mesopotamian text as a kind of sort of chord progression, I think. Each interval name gives you 2 string names. And so, it moves through these different intervals. It must be some sort of harmonic change that's happening under the song. There's been a lot of attempts to convert this into melody, and I think they're all doomed to fail because I don't think melody is encoded in that information. But it at least gives you some sense of the tonalities that were used in that one piece, in that one city, at that one time. So, it's a lot better than no information, but still it's only a couple of points of information in a very large area over a very large period.
Well, that's a beautiful answer. And I know we have some follow-up questions coming from the community. Okay, so one of the questions people wanted to, can you say the name again of the person making the reproduction instrument?
Andy Lowings, Lowings. He was an engineer by trade that got, heard the song of ancient music and has devoted himself to this Lyre of Ur project. Yeah, they do performances in the UK and around Europe also.
Great. I know we have a couple of images. Would this be a good time to share some of that now that
I suppose.
anything?
Sure. Okay. How about the 9th image, the final one?
So as our colleague Sarah pulls it up, oh, super fast, Sarah. Gosh.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
So what are we looking at here?
Okay. So this is another great. I sort of mentioned King David as our best analogy for understanding what is otherwise an indirect argument about Kinyras and Kinyras on pre-Greek Cyprus. This is another great piece of evidence for that case because it comes from the 13th century. That's the most recent dating on the basis of a very thorough study, metallurgical study. It originates on Cyprus, comes from the 13th century. So it's the right place, the right time. It shows, it's a bronze stand, not as tall as it looks. It's about a foot high. It's at the British Museum. It's got 4 sides, and one of them shows a seated musician playing a harp of Mesopotamian style. We know from comparative iconography that this is Mesopotamian or Mesopotamianizing. It's not a Kinyras style lyre, which would have been awesome. That would have really just been, however, it is Mesopotamian, and on the larger argument, this is relevant to the transmission of these ideas. So you've got a seated figure. He's facing right. 3 other figures are carrying things and they're facing left. So you have iconographically a distinction between the one figure with the instrument and the other 3 figures. They're opposite. So there's some contrast being drawn. Also, he's seated, they're standing. A seated figure is typically interpreted as either a king or a god. So he's some sort of higher status than the other figures. But he's also playing in front of what is usually identified as a sacred tree. This is a very common Near Eastern motif all through the Near East in many different forms, but typically is interpreted as a symbol of a goddess figure of some sort. So we seem to have either a musician king, maybe a musician priest, a musician god, maybe all 3 at once, playing music. He seems to be in a rapturous posture to a tree, which seems to represent a goddess. And we think, of course, of Kinyras and Aphrodite, because he's the beloved priest of Aphrodite. And the tree is in all 4 scenes. So the tree is the uniting figure of all of them. In a way, it's the controlling figure, because everybody is doing something relating to the tree. The other figures are bringing what appear to be offerings. The bottom 2 are mysterious, but the top one is very clearly a bronze ingot, the form in which Cypriot copper in the Bronze Age was transported. It was put into these shapes so you could carry it on your shoulder, load it into the hold of the Uluburun wreck, which has all that Cypriot copper on it, and transport it around, which we know that the kingdom of Alashia did. The other 2, the one on the lower left, Barnett called that cup and napkins. I like to think it's a very long string of sejukos, that Cypriot delicacy, but I know it's not really that. And the person on the lower right, maybe little jugs of perfumed oil. That would be great because Kinyras is connected with that, but maybe it's fish. It's something. but it seems to symbolize all the different products or processes being brought to a central place, which is governed by a goddess figure, who is in turn worshipped by a higher status figure that may be a king slash priest slash god, lesser god, servant god, that is worshiping the goddess in a way that sort of brings together these tributary processes of the other sides. So this whole picture is very much what I argued for the function of Kinyras as a kind of royal symbol on the pre-Greek island.
Wow. Okay. I think that really, that image really does bring it all together for us.
Yeah.
So, I just want to turn it back to the community now. Who has a comment or question? Because we've covered so much. Unfortunately, I know time flies so fast. We only have about 9 minutes left. And
wow,
there's still
fast.
Yes, I know. And there's always so much more to talk about. Any other comments and questions, friends? Yes, sir.
Yes, I just wanted to touch very briefly about the wood. You mentioned earlier on about myrrh and also the wood that the lyre was constructed from, and I wondered how that related to this whole story and this cycle. And I was also sort of comparing it to things like Achilles and ambrosial things. Is there any connection, or is it a different tradition?
No, it's very relevant. So to start with the myrrh and maybe conclude with the myrrh, so as I mentioned at the start, we have 2 divinized objects in the Ugaritic text, the lyre and the incense burner. And myrrh has many uses in the Bronze Age Near East. One of them is as a perfuming agent and used in incense. So when this was discovered, William Albright, great American Semiticist, immediately said, oh, look at this connection. This is Kinyras and myrrh, potentially. It would have been great if it had been MR with a divine determinative. Divine myrrh would have been fantastic. I've speculated that at Byblos, where we don't have these texts, that was in fact the case, because Kinyras' most ancient kingdom in one strand of the tradition is precisely Byblos. And the phonology of the word takes us to the Canaanite area where Byblos is. But in any event, you've got these 2 objects that are closely allied by virtue of being the only 2 that are divinized, and they're adjacent in the god list. So as I mentioned earlier on, it was common in Mesopotamia for divinized objects to be attached to master gods or the gods in whose cult they served, by family relationships, either a son or daughter or so on. So we find Myrrha precisely as the daughter of Kinyras. So it would, this conforms to the pattern that we might expect. If these 2 things reflect, if they're later mythological reflections of earlier divinized object conceptions, it's not surprising to find them connected by a family relationship and to find a specific myth explaining the connection or elaborating the connection, as we have with Kinyras and Myrrha. So now myrrh is used for lots of things. It's used for royal anointing rites. That's well documented in Ugaritic and Hittite texts, so that becomes relevant as well. It's used as an embalming agent in Egypt. I argued for a connection between the divine Kinaru and the royal cults of Ugarit and Syria, so this is potentially relevant as well. It gets into the realm of speculation, but the pieces seem to point in the right direction. Yeah. As far as the wood of the instruments, I didn't go too far in that direction, but anyone who's interested in pursuing it, there are surviving specimens of Kinaru-type lyres from Egypt. There's one in Leiden, there's one at the Met in New York, there's a number of others, and I believe these have been studied carefully for their construction, but I didn't go into that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so, I think Sarah's kind of bringing us back to the kind of topics that we've been thinking about in our community. We're thinking about the function of the hero in ancient Greek culture. We spent a lot of time as a community maybe thinking about the passage of Achilles playing the lyre when the embassy arrives in Rhapsody 9 or Scroll 9 of the Iliad. How can our community sort of think about the role of a hero such as Kinyras in relation to the views of the hero that we've been thinking about, in particular based upon the research of Gregory Nott? I mean, do you see connections when you talk about, a conflict between Apollo and Kinyras? I mean, that rings for me with the kind of ideas about antagonism between gods and heroes that Greg has been talking about. So are these related? How can we make connections?
They are connected by virtue of being juxtaposed, but I think it's also an area in which we're seeing the disjunction between pre-Greek Cypriot culture and the sorts of Greek phenomena we see with the ideas of the hero. So for instance, Achilles playing the lyre, famous passage, he's meditating on whether he should go home or whether he should stay and die and become, he's singing about the deeds of men, the Clea Andron. Will he stay and perform such deeds and therefore be commemorated? So it's a very pregnant scene from the perspective of a singer and epic song. Now, there's a lot of other evidence about Greek lyre myths in the Greek world, others that seem to be connected more with properly lyric traditions, sort of liturgical music. So Orpheus, Linus is connected as a lyrist with lamentation traditions. So there's several musical strands, or several even lyric strands, using lyric to mean lyre, not lyric poetry in that usual sense, that we find in Greece. And Achilles is one. I have a paper in which I looked at some of these sort of non-epic lyre heroes. Amphion building the walls of Thebes with his lyre to have 7 gates because of the 7 strings. And I argued that these other non-epic ones are really more, they have clearer Near Eastern sympathies, whereas the commemoration of epic as clearer Greek and perhaps Indo-European sympathies. Kinyras specifically, he seems to have been a kind of professional, patron for Cypriot lyrists. There's a Pindaric scholion that says more or less this. He's connected with lamentation singing. So he does play an analogous role, but the performance context that we can reconstruct for these Cypriot lyrists must have included epic, of course, with the Greek influx. But lamentation is really the dominant association for Kinyras for some reason. I have this in chapter 12 of my book. And this is a very old and established Near Eastern cultic practice. You also have it in the Aegean, Linus and Hyacinth and other cases like that. So I haven't found much evidence connecting Kinyras with epic song per se. He is connected with the epic cycle insofar as incoming Greek heroes become connected with his story. So Agamemnon throws him off the Cypriot throne in one local Greco-Cypriot tradition. Teucros comes and marries his daughter. Agapenor comes from Arcadia and seems to marry into the royal house or becomes, the new Kinyras sort of king there. So there is a connection, but again, it seems to express, contrasting musical traditions coming together. That would be my answer to that.
Great. We have just 2 minutes left. Your book is so rich in many, many ways. I just want to offer a chance for you to talk about the illustrations in your book, because there are almost 50 of them. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why that was important? Yeah.
Yes. So the book is very much a labor of love. I met my wife, Glynis Fox, on Cyprus, and Cyprus has been sort of central to our relationship. And so the whole thing is a labor of love as a kind of dedication to Aphrodite, but also to Glynis. And one of the reasons I fell in love with her was her art. And she did all of the artwork here. And I really wanted the book to be an artist's book in a sense. I wanted it to be the scholarly book too, but I wanted it to just be a book that even if you could never get through all of it, very likely possibility, that it would sit on your shelf and look fantastic. And so she did this brilliant cover of a sort of a Kinyras figure floating on a bronze ingot in front of the ruins of the Bronze Age site of Alasa. She did the 50 drawings. She's an excellent technical illustrator, but all her technical drawings also have a very fluid artistic quality to them. And then she did a number of original sort of Kinyras themed illustrations. And anyway, it really makes the book, I think.
Yeah. And so we just want to share her name with everyone. It's Glynis Fox, Glynnis Fox, Fawkes. She has a website where you can explore her work. She does a lot of other work that's also related to the ancient world. She's a cartoonist. She's an archaeological illustrator. I think people will just be really pleased if they have the time to explore that site. Any last words about that? Yeah.
Well, I feel I should throw out one last shout out to Wolfgang Hempel, who's a retired Assyriologist from Berkeley, and he contributed a fantastic 70-page study of Balan gods in Mesopotamia that he could easily have published as his own book. But he threw it in there because he believed in the project, and I hope it gives some credibility to Near Eastern studies specialists to the rest of the book. And it's a great study in its own right, quite technical, but very well worth perusing the data in there.
Yes. So I just want to remind everyone you can get the book through Harvard University Press. You can read the entire thing online, so check it out at chs.harvard.edu. Just browse to the publications page, and you can look for John C. Franklin. So John, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we just scratched the surface of the topics we could have discussed today. You know, I'd like to invite you to come back and join us again and talk about some more ancient music. What do you think?
That sounds fun. Sounds great.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all our guests and the people viewing. I hope you all have a good day and come back and join us. We have other scholars. We have a scholar coming in 2 weeks to talk about Homeric similes. So join us then. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.